Lately, I've found myself buried in stories of paranormal experiences. It's no surprise, my own encounters have only deepened my interest. Once you've seen enough, patterns start to emerge. Cold spots in the house, objects out of place, strange noises that no one can explain. They all share the same eerie traits. It becomes impossible to ignore. Humanity's obsession with ghosts and monsters is ancient, stretching back to the earliest cave drawings. For millennia, we've been haunted by the unknown, crafting stories of spirits and beasts that follow a familiar set of rules. In many ways, these legends have become a rite of passage in cultures across the world. Today, we look at these age-old rituals with skepticism. Ouija boards and Victorian seances are little more than clichés, relics of a time when people truly feared the unseen. But here's the twist. You might be wondering how someone who's had their own experiences with the supernatural can be so cynical about ghosts. Well, let me tell you, poltergeists aren't your average ghost. There's something much, much worse. It didn't start with a bang. These things never do. They begin with a slow burn, and unless you're paying attention, you won't notice the fuse until it's too late. For me, it started with something as simple as dishes. The kind of mundane task I usually left for later. Plates left in the sink, waiting to be cleaned, only to find them mysteriously washed, dried, and stacked neatly next to the basin when I returned. Being a rational person, I chalked it up to forgetfulness. My mind's not always the sharpest when I'm stressed, and when you're juggling work and life, it's easy to misplace a few moments. At first, I didn't think much of it. Strange occurrences didn't seem like much of a nuisance. Occasionally, the TV remote would go missing, or my car keys would end up in the oddest spots. But considering that my dishes were being cleaned and the trash was disappearing, the so-called spirit seemed almost helpful. A bit too considerate for my liking, actually. I wasn't yet ready to believe in ghosts. Moving items could always be explained away by mundane causes. I wanted to be logical, not jump to conclusions based on wishful thinking. But then something strange happened. My underwear started disappearing. It's not uncommon to lose a sock in the wash, but when I noticed that week after week, a bra or a pair of panties was gone, and only the older ones, the ones I wouldn't miss as much, I started to feel uneasy. In the midst of all this, I tried to push the weirdness to the back of my mind. My nephew's birthday was coming up. He was turning 7, and last year, I'd made the terrible mistake of baking his cake myself. It was a disaster, but somehow I got crowned super aunt, which meant that the pressure to outdo myself this year was on. Cake after cake, year after year, no matter what, it had to be grand. Eggs, butter, and flour piled up on the countertop as I tried to figure out what on earth I could make for this kid. 10 years ago it was easy, a Buzz Lightyear cake or a Shrek one. But now, who knows what he'd want? I was holding a bag of flour when it happened. A cold, stiff brush of air ran through my hair, followed by something alive. It moved. I screamed in shock, the flour bag slipping from my hands and bursting open, covering the entire room in a cloud of white. The cloud of flour hung in the air, distorting the space around it. The atmosphere warped, as if something was moving just beyond sight. A shape, vaguely human, took form, its body outlined by the flour as it stuck to its shifting form. It made a strange, angry clicking noise, like it was startled by the unintentional reveal. In a blur, the figure shook the flour off and slipped back into nothingness, as though it had never been there. Despite its attempt to blend back into the shadows, there was no mistaking what it was, at least in shape. It was human, or something that had once been human. I didn't think, I didn't hesitate. Screaming as though my life depended on it, I sprinted down the hallway, past the place where the figure had been, and made a dash for the front door. My heart was hammering in my chest, but I had to get out. Behind me, the air seemed to vibrate with anger. There was a sharp, staccato clicking sound, followed by the sickening crunch of bone against the wooden floors. Heavy, dragging steps chasing me. I reached the door, yanked the handle, and flung it open, my mind screaming for escape. But just as I thought I'd made it, something cold and sharp grabbed my throat. In a swift motion, it hurled me back into the hallway. My feet barely touched the ground as I crashed against the floor, gasping for air with a searing pain in my neck. The door slammed shut, and I heard the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock. A loud final click rang out as the tumblers fell into place, and then, as if to prove its control over my world, the key snapped off in the lock with an almost mocking finality. No way out now. Not through that door. It hissed again, and I felt the vibrations through the floorboards as a series of sharp clicks followed, like a warning. Look what you made me do. The shattered key was dropped onto my chest. A bitter token of its power. I thought it was over then. My breath hitched in my throat as I closed my eyes, bracing for the crushing grip of its cold fingers. It had thrown me like a rag doll. With a single squeeze, it could snap my neck without breaking a sweat. But it didn't. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Cold hands, gentle yet firm, slipped beneath my back, lifting me with ease. I gasped in shock as I was hoisted off the ground. I could feel the weight of its presence, an unnerving closeness, and I realized, with a mix of confusion and relief, that it wasn't trying to hurt me. The poltergeist, for lack of a better word, lowered me onto the couch with care. Not dropped, but set down deliberately, like an object that had to be placed just right. Its presence seemed to evaporate into the air, the only trace of it being the faintest breeze as it moved. I lay there for a moment, trying to comprehend what had just happened, but my mind was too jumbled. The feeling of its hands on me was still fresh, and I couldn't shake the thought, how many times had I felt that breeze before? How many times had I dismissed it as nothing? Before I could process this, something else strange happened. A glass of water, no, a full glass of water, seemed to levitate into the room, hovering in mid-air at the same height I had been lifted. The sight of it was more disorienting than the violent encounter that had just occurred. The glass floated in front of me, still. And then, the invisible presence nudged me with one of its rough, almost bone-crunching fingers, as if to say, "Take it." I stared at the water. What the hell was going on? The poltergeist, or whatever it was invisible, but it had weight, it had presence. It was intelligent, but didn't speak. It didn't feel aggressive, not in the way ghosts or demons do, but there was an undeniable, deadly strength beneath its calm. I realized then, in a brief flash of clarity, that I had learned more about the supernatural in these moments than any person ever should. I didn't know whether to be awed or horrified. Probably both. I took the glass, my hands trembling. The water was just tap water, cool and unremarkable. I drank it slowly, each sip feeling surreal, as though the act of drinking could somehow bring me closer to understanding what was happening. When the glass was empty, I set it down carefully, glancing around, wondering if the creature, the poltergeist, was still watching me. I hadn't heard a breeze in a while, but I felt its presence, as though it was waiting, observing. The poltergeist gently lifted the glass from my hand, and with a quiet whoosh, it carried the glass away. I could hear the rush of water from the kitchen faucet, followed by the sound of a towel wiping over glass, a peculiar, almost domestic touch for such a creature. A neat freak, of all things. It felt completely out of place for a poltergeist, a being of chaos and destruction, to care about cleaning up after itself. A gust of wind stirred the air, signaling the return of the unseen entity. My body tensed, anticipating whatever would come next. You don't lay someone down comfortably and give them a drink if you're planning to kill them, right? That thought raced through my mind, pushing aside the overwhelming sense of dread. But even as it took hold, I knew better than to try applying logic to this situation. The very existence of this thing, this poltergeist, made a mockery of conventional understanding. There were no rules here, and yet, nothing happened. It stayed where it was, motionless at the center of the room. The silence hung thick in the air, as though it was waiting for me to make a move, to do something. It was the kind of stillness that presses in on you, forcing you to wonder if you're the one out of place. Are you going to hurt me? The words slipped out before I could stop them, my voice barely more than a whisper. A soft cluster of clicks answered me, but nothing else. The silence stretched out, holding us both in a strange, suspended moment. For several minutes, the room remained still, the air thick with unspoken tension. Okay, I muttered, trying to gather myself. I need to know some things, and for that, I need to ask you some things. If the answer to any of my questions is yes, tap twice on the wall. If it's no, just tap once. Do you understand? I waited, my heart pounding in my chest. The room felt colder now, as if the poltergeist was weighing my request, deciding whether or not to indulge me. A brief pause, and then softly but undeniably I heard it. Tap, tap. Okay, are you going to hurt me? I asked again, my voice steadier now. A single tap echoed through the room. I exhaled, the tension leaving my body in a slow, relieved breath. Good, thank you. Have you been here for a while? I pressed on, feeling both stupid and desperate. Tap, tap. Over a week? I asked next, heart racing in my throat. Tap, tap. Over a year? Tap. That was something, I thought. Some minor relief, maybe. Have you been stealing my underwear? I blurted out before I could self, my voice laced with disbelief. It was a ridiculous question. Ridiculous, yet necessary. There was a long pause, a pause that seemed to scream embarrassment. Then finally, the answer. Tap. Tap. Am I allowed to leave? I asked, the question slipping out before I could second-guess myself. The air shifted. The poltergeist's presence seemed to intensify, and the next thing I knew, a fist, or something resembling a fist, slammed into the wall. The sound was deafening, the impact leaving an apple-sized crater in the bricks. Cracks spider-webbed out from the impact point, splitting the wall in all directions. And then, in a voice that wasn't a voice, the answer came again. Tap. It's been a week since I last wrote, and the poltergeist has kept me a prisoner in my own home. I can't even count how many times I've cursed myself for being such an antisocial hermit before. Back when I'd gone off the grid for a few days, it never mattered, and now, no one is coming to find me. In its own mind, I'm sure it believes it's been incredibly accommodating to such an ungrateful guest. It cleans the cups and dishes every night, does my laundry every morning, and prepares meals from the increasingly sparse stock in the house. Last night, in its frustration, it made me a bowl of graham crackers microwaved in some grotesque bisque of goldfish and spearmint toothpaste. When I gagged too much to finish it, it threw all my plates against the walls. We haven't communicated much lately. In fact, I think it's given me the silent treatment after my last failed escape, a particularly pathetic attempt to climb out of the second-story bathroom window. The result? Well, the punishment was proportional, I suppose. It broke only 3 of my toes, a small victory in my eyes. But there's one question that has been eating at me from the very start, one that I've been needing to ask but only realized the importance of last night. Is this poltergeist in love with me? Tap. Fucking. Tap. I had been a model prisoner since it broke my toes, doing my best to play by its increasingly meticulous rules. Rules, mind you, that I was learning only through trial and error. I'm sure in its twisted mind it thinks of itself as some kind of gentleman, only hurting me when the punishment is proportional to my crime. Escape, disobedience, ungratefulness. For something so powerful, it sure is easy to upset. What's worse is that I have no way of knowing whether it's around at any given time. The best I can do is assume that it is. The only place in this house that feels safe, that seems off limits to this malicious thing, is inside my head. And that's where I've been doing all my planning. I've let it play house with me, letting it think I'm just some harmless, malleable object to manipulate and enjoy. But sooner or later, I'm going to turn the tables on its ass. I'll wait for it to let its guard down, and then I'll go full child's play on it. The poltergeist had ripped the landline out of the wall on day 2, but the cell phone in the drawer of my bedside cabinet? My love-struck monster didn't seem to know about that. I poured myself a glass of Coke, making sure to leave some noticeable residue at the bottom. It was a perfect trap. The clean freak poltergeist couldn't resist cleaning. Stepping back, I watched as my bait worked. Just as I expected, the glass floated off the countertop, and a dish towel was yanked from the kitchen radiator. Excellent. This gave me a rough idea of where its body might be. Knowing how quickly it can move, I didn't waste a second. I lunged for the chef's knife from the rack, and while the poltergeist was distracted by polishing the glass, I plunged it into what I guessed was the creature's chest. The shriek it let out was ear-piercing. Viscous, black blood, or whatever it was, squirted out of nowhere, splattering onto the freshly cleaned glass. I didn't hesitate. This brief moment bought me some precious seconds, and I sprinted up the stairs, hearing the poltergeist's monstrous screams echoing behind me. I leapt through the bedroom doorway, slammed the door shut, locked it, bolted it, and shoved a stool under the doorknob. I knew that wouldn't hold for long, but I was out of time. As soon as I secured the door, I rushed to the bedside cabinet, frantically hammering in 911, my fingers nearly snapping under the pressure of dialing so fast. Something big, something furious, was rumbling up the stairs. Before the police dispatcher could even finish her scripted greeting, I found myself screaming into the receiver. Something is in my house and it's trying to fucking kill me. Something, ma'am? Even though the poltergeist was hammering at the door now, I could still hear the incredulity in the dispatcher's voice. But I wasn't about to let the truth get in the way of getting rescued. He's got a fucking gun. He's armed. I'm locked in, and he's hammering my goddamn door down. I held the receiver towards the door, letting the dispatcher hear the pounding. You're gonna need to knock down my front door, or he's going to fucking murder me. I've dispatched some officers, ma'am. ETA is about 2 minutes. Can you stay on the line? The door splintered into toothpicks with a deafening boom. The poltergeist had gotten in. I screamed at the top of my lungs as it cleared the room, my phone exploding in my hand. I felt the searing pain of the creature's hand slapping across my cheek, knocking me onto my bed. My cheek instantly swelled, bruises forming under the skin, hot and painful. This is it, I thought. I'm going to die. Things moved in slow motion after that. I could hear the low, guttural growl of the poltergeist as it circled the bed. I could see the black blood, the black, viscous substance, spraying out of nowhere, splattering across my duvet. I knew what it was planning, calculating some twisted punishment for my disobedience. A cold, invisible hand pressed down on my chest, suffocating, squeezing the life out of me like a vice. It wasn't trying to kill me. No, that would be too simple. It had been obsessed with me for too long to let me die that easily. No, it was just holding me down. Paralyzed. I could feel the springs of my mattress groaning as the poltergeist crawled onto the bed, its hand still pressing firmly on my chest, and I felt its blood soaking into the fabric beneath me. Its free hand tugged at the button of my jeans, working clumsily to undo it. When I realized what it was doing, I started kicking and screaming, trying to make as much noise as I could. But it was no use. The creature's hand shot to my throat, cutting off my scream and silencing me in an instant. I could feel the pressure, like a vice around my neck, and its other hand continued its sick, haphazard work on my jeans. My eyes darted around the room, desperately searching for anything that could help me escape. My gaze locked onto the full-length mirror that stood at the foot of my bed. And then I saw it. I couldn't see the poltergeist directly, not while it was straddling me, not while it was trying to force itself onto me, but in the mirror, I could see it clearly. Its reflection was undeniable. It was long, hairless, and almost skeletal in appearance, with skin that looked like burnt newspaper, dark, coarse, and cracked. I could see its ribs, its spine, the protruding vertebrae that pulsed in and out with each labored breath it took. The monster was grotesque, its very image a nightmare made flesh. I saw it finally manage to wrestle open the button on my jeans, and then it started peeling down the zipper, taking perverse, slow delight in each movement. I could feel its grip on my throat tightening, its invisible fingers strangling the life out of me as the black blood splattered with more force, more frequency. I thought I was going to suffocate, or worse, be torn apart. And then I heard it. "Ma'am, is everything okay?" The cop's voice rang out from downstairs. In the mirror, I saw the poltergeist's head snap around, its reflection turning to track the sound of the officer's shout. The distraction was enough. Its grip on my throat loosened, just slightly. It was finally my chance. With all the remaining strength I had left, I lunged for the nightstand and grabbed the bedside lamp. The weight of the lamp base felt like a weapon forged from my own desperation, my fury and the hatred that had built up over the week of being its prisoner. I swung it with everything I had, smashing it into the side of the poltergeist's head. The force sent a sickening crack through the air. Once wasn't enough. I smashed it again and again and again, each strike fueled by the relentless terror and anger I'd been drowning in. The poltergeist's grip on my throat weakened, and I could feel its invisible fingers slowly drawing away. I didn't stop. I kept hitting it, even as its growls and furious screeches filled the room until its hand finally recoiled. "Help!" I screamed, louder than I'd ever screamed anything in my life. "Please, Somebody help me. I was desperate, panicked, but I could hear the sound of the officers smashing through the front door, their footsteps thundering through the house. I knew I didn't have much time. My mind was racing as I glanced toward the mirror. The poltergeist was still recovering from the blows. With no more time to waste, I sped past it, not looking back, and ran down the stairs, praying that the officers would make it in time. Tears streamed down my face as I saw the two officers standing in the hallway, pistols drawn, their eyes scanning the space like they'd trained for this moment. "Thank God you're here," I sobbed. "We need to get out of here." I grabbed one of the officers, clinging to him, as if he could somehow shield me from the nightmare that had become my life. The other officer gave me a stern, almost annoyed look. "We need to take care of the threat," he said coldly, his voice as hard as the poltergeist's hands had been. "You can save the congratulations for later, ma'am." No, I insisted, pulling at his arm with desperation. "It doesn't matter. We just need to get out of here, right now." The officer hesitated, then started heading up the stairs, his pistol drawn in front of him, steady and ready. "I'll secure the area. Officer Harvey will escort you out." I watched them move, my heart hammering in my chest, and then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A single drip of black blood hit the step in front of the officer. Then another. "No!" I shrieked, the blood curdling in my veins. The officer turned, his face registering disbelief, before his gun was suddenly and violently batted from his hands. Before he could react, his head twisted, as though some invisible force had gripped his neck and turned it on a cruel axis. His neck snapped with a sickening crack, his body collapsing, the severed head rolling down the stairs in a gruesome arc. Arterial blood sprayed across the floor, staining everything in its path. I recoiled, hands covering my mouth as bile rose in my throat. Horror gripped me, but I had no time to process what I had just seen. Officer Harvey lunged forward, blindly firing his weapon, his screams echoing in the small space. I could hear the deafening roar of the poltergeist in response, a monstrous sound of pure rage. But it wasn't enough. Officer Harvey wasn't enough. I turned away, terrified to look, and scrambled through the open doorway toward the safety of the car outside. I heard the screams from inside. Officer Harvey's scream cutting through the air as his legs snapped under the poltergeist's grip. The sickening sound of bone breaking echoed down the hallway, and then the chaos resumed. I couldn't bear to look back as I bolted for the door, but I heard it all. The screams, the growls, the savage tearing sounds, as if the world itself was being torn apart behind me. I didn't stop running until I was in the car, the engine roaring to life beneath my trembling hands. The poltergeist had effortlessly killed 2 armed police officers. 2 lives snuffed out in an instant, just like that. And now, it was coming for me. I scrambled into the driver's seat of my Honda Civic, my hands trembling as I stabbed the keys into the ignition. The engine roared to life, and I slammed the car into gear, my foot pressing so hard on the gas pedal that I was sure it would break through the floor. But just before I could fully escape, I had to steal one last look at my house, just to make sure it wasn't already too late. The poltergeist was stepping out over the threshold, its black eyes gleaming with hatred. Its lipless mouth hung open, revealing jagged teeth like broken glass, and its growl was the kind of sound that chilled the soul. The wounds from the knife and gunshots seemed to fester, the flesh torn and ragged. Its body was twisted, its genitals grotesque, covered in thorns that seemed to writhe with malicious life. And its hands, those shimmering claws, were the stuff of nightmares. I locked eyes with it in that moment. It knew I could see it clearly now, all its fury and malice oozing out with every movement. It seemed almost satisfied, like it had been waiting for me to finally understand the full weight of its hatred. With a burst of speed, I slammed my foot on the gas, tearing away from my house and into the night. I drove with no destination, just away. My home wasn't mine anymore, and there were 2 dead officers in there, one headless, the other who knows how much worse. For all intents and purposes, my life as I knew it was over. It's been maybe 5 or 6 hours since I left. I'm sitting here now, in the dimly lit room of a motel. I parked the car over a mile away and walked, hoping the poltergeist wouldn't recognize it. Without a mirror, I have no way of knowing if it's already found me, but I can feel it. I know it's coming. This is where my story ends, I guess. The book's open, and soon it'll be closed, by the poltergeist itself. But, as I sit here and think, something nags at me. If there are things in this world that we can't see, things that exist just beyond our understanding, what are the chances that the one chasing me is the only one? I've always had a knack for attracting the paranormal. I can't quite explain it, but it seems to be part of who I am. My maternal grandfather has always been a bit strange. We don't communicate much, and when we do, it's usually uncomfortable. He's deep into conspiracy theories, convinced that he's made contact with extraterrestrials. Now, I tend to believe in a lot of paranormal phenomena, but aliens are a bit beyond my comfort zone. Still, there's one thing I have to admit. He might have been right about one thing. When I was just an infant, he told my mom that I would be a gateway for ghosts. For the most part, it was just my mom and me. My dad was in the army, so he was often away, leaving us to handle everything on our own. When I was a baby, we were stationed in Germany, and my dad was deployed to fight in Desert Storm. Those were difficult times for our family. My mom used to tell me how she would often find herself alone in our apartment, staying up late at night. She'd hear strange footsteps echoing in the quiet hallways. They sounded like the footsteps of children, running from my room toward hers. At first, she'd think it was me waking up, but when she waited for someone to come into her room, the footsteps would suddenly stop, just before they reached her door. I can only imagine how eerie that must have been for her. She said that sometimes after hearing the footsteps, she would get up, expecting to find me standing there, but there was never anyone. It happened so often that it became a regular occurrence. I wonder if it was the ghosts my grandfather had predicted, or perhaps it was something else, something I couldn't understand at the time. Now, to most people, the events I've described might not seem all that creepy. But for my mom and me, it was terrifying, especially since we were alone in the apartment and I couldn't even walk yet. However, that's not the story I'm here to tell. No, my real story begins with a single, fateful encounter with a poltergeist, and it all started with an Ouija board. According to Wikipedia, poltergeists are typically described as mischievous spirits that don't haunt a specific location, but instead focus on a particular person. That's how they differ from ghosts, which are usually tied to certain places. My experience began when we were stationed at Fort Knox, and my dad was deployed in Korea. I was around 12 years old when I received the Ouija board as a birthday gift. It wasn't anything fancy or high-end, just a standard version you could buy at Toys R Us. The thing that made it special to me was that it glowed in the dark, which seemed pretty cool to a preteen at the time. It was the late 90s, and the warnings about Ouija boards being potentially dangerous weren't as widespread as they are today. To us, it was just a harmless game, something that might be a little spooky, but not much more than that. On a Saturday night, I had some friends over for a sleepover, and naturally, we decided to break out the Ouija board. We sat in a circle, giggling like the typical preteen girls we were, and placed our hands on the plastic planchette, eager to communicate with whatever spirits might be around. "Is there anyone here with us?" I asked, my voice filled with that mix of excitement and nervousness. At first, nothing happened. The planchette stayed still, and the board remained silent. We waited a few minutes, the silence thickening as we all looked around at each other, trying to hide our growing sense of awkwardness. "Come on, let's ask something else," one of my friends suggested, her voice wavering. "Are there any spirits here?" Again, nothing. For the next 5 minutes, I asked a string of mundane questions, hoping for some sign that something or someone was actually listening. But all we got was a cold, indifferent silence. "This is boring," I said, finally giving in. "Let's just go watch a movie or something." Feeling disappointed, I packed the board up and shoved it back into its box, stashing it on a shelf in the coat closet. Little did I know, just because the Ouija board didn't seem to work that night didn't mean that something wasn't paying attention. That night, I began experiencing violent and bloody nightmares. Nightmares that were so vivid and terrifying they left me paralyzed with fear. The images of blood, violence, and horror seemed so real, so intense, that they haunted me even when I was awake. After a few nights of this, I couldn't sleep in my room anymore. I moved into my mom's room, lying on the floor beside her, unable to escape the nightmares that tormented me in the dark. But the worst was yet to come. A few days later, I was out running errands with my mom. When we returned home, it was already dark outside. The moment we stepped up to our apartment door, we knew something was wrong. The door was wide open, and the shrill beeping of alarm clocks could be heard echoing through the apartment. I can't describe the dread that washed over me. My mom immediately decided we shouldn't go inside alone, so we got our neighbor, a man we hardly knew, to bring his gun and check the apartment. What we found inside was unsettling to say the least. Furniture had been overturned, pictures on the walls were hanging upside down, and every single alarm clock in the apartment was blaring. But nothing had been stolen. Nothing seemed out of place, except for the fact that everything was off. The air felt heavy, charged with a strange, unexplainable energy. Whatever had been in our apartment had left a mark. Over the next few weeks, the disturbances escalated. We would walk into the kitchen to find every single cabinet door wide open. Sometimes, we'd find something small, like a chair moved across the room, or a door that we were sure we had closed now mysteriously ajar. But the worst part was when I walked into the bathroom one day and saw a large red X scratched onto the bathroom mirror. I froze, staring at it in shock. When I told my mom, she simply said, "If you don't acknowledge it, you won't give it power. Just clean it up and move on." But no matter how hard we tried to ignore it, the entity seemed to grow more powerful. It didn't like being dismissed, and it wasn't going to let us forget about it. One evening, as my mom and I sat in the living room talking, there was a sudden earth-shattering crash. The sound was so loud it felt like a bull had charged through the room, smashing everything in its path. We both ran upstairs, hearts racing. But when we reached the top of the stairs, we found nothing. No sign of what had caused the noise. The house was eerily quiet again, as if nothing had happened at all. But deep down, we both knew something was very wrong. Things came to a head one night. I was in the middle of a typical preteen argument with my mom, furious over something trivial. I stomped up the stairs, slammed my door shut, and threw myself onto my bed, sobbing dramatically into my pillow. On one side of my room, my bed and bookshelf were arranged in their usual place, the bookshelves stacked with old paperbacks, and my snow globe collection proudly displayed. On the other side of the room, my dresser and closet stood. It was in that moment that something happened, something that I still can't explain. I heard a loud, shattering noise, and when I turned, I saw that one of my snow globes had exploded into pieces, the glass shattering against the closet door. I froze, staring at the debris in shock. My heart pounded in my chest as I called out for my mom. But the moment I did, all hell broke loose. The lights began flickering violently, as if someone were messing with the electrical wiring. My bookshelf toppled over, sending books flying in all directions. I screamed, my voice rising in terror, as the room seemed to come alive with chaos. The walls felt like they were closing in, and I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to acknowledge its presence. I sprinted towards my door, hands shaking as I tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. It felt as if the door had been sealed shut, locked by some invisible force. I could hear my mom on the other side, frantic, struggling to open it and calling out my name. Her voice was filled with panic, but no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't get through. The door remained firm, as if it were made of solid steel. In a panic, I kicked and pounded on the door, my chest tight with fear. I screamed for my mom to help me, my voice raw with desperation. Above me, I heard the sickening sound of a light bulb shattering, the glass raining down like tiny lethal fragments. My heart was racing, and the terror felt suffocating. I felt completely helpless, as though I were trapped in some horrible nightmare where there was no escape. And then, in the midst of the chaos, something grabbed my hair. It felt like an icy, invisible hand latching onto my scalp, yanking me down to the floor with such force that I lost my balance and fell hard onto the ground. I could feel my hair being tugged out of my scalp, the roots burning with a sharp, searing pain. I screamed, twisting my body in a futile attempt to break free. My body felt as if it were being dragged across the floor, away from the door, towards my bed. As I struggled, I felt sharp, jagged pieces of glass digging into my skin, tiny shards from the broken light bulb embedding themselves into my arms and legs. Every movement I made seemed to intensify the pain, but I kept fighting, desperate to escape whatever was pulling me. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I couldn't tell if I was still screaming or if the sound of my own terror had swallowed me whole. Suddenly, everything went still. The force pulling me vanished, and the grip on my hair was released. I lay there, gasping for breath, my body covered in cuts and bruises, my heart racing like a drum in my chest. I didn't move at first, afraid that whatever had just happened might start again if I did. But then I heard the door slam open, and my mom rushed into the room. I scrambled to my feet, stumbling toward her, my head throbbing and blood dripping from the cuts on my arms and legs. But I was alive, and that's all that mattered. My mom wrapped her arms around me, pulling me into an embrace as I cried against her shoulder. I could feel the tremors of fear still racking my body, but I was safe for now. "We need to leave, now," my mom said urgently. Her voice was firm, and I could hear the fear in it, but also a sense of determination. I nodded, not needing any more convincing. Whatever was happening in that house was beyond our control, and I knew we couldn't stay there any longer. We rushed down the stairs, adrenaline pumping through my veins. My mom yanked open the closet door, pulling out jackets, when a box fell to the floor with a dull thud. I recognized it immediately. It was the box that held the Ouija board. "Did you play with this?" my mom asked, her voice strained with a mixture of confusion and anger. "Yeah," I replied softly, my voice shaky, "about a month ago, but nothing happened." I could feel the weight of the situation hanging in the air, like an unspoken truth we both knew but didn't want to acknowledge. Without saying another word, my mom picked up the box, her face set in a determined expression. She turned and walked toward the backyard, the box clutched tightly in her hands. I followed her, my heart still racing, but there was something almost comforting about the way she took charge. When we reached the yard, she pulled out a lighter, her hands steady despite the chaos that had just unfolded. She set the box on fire, the flames licking up greedily, devouring the board and its dark energy. I don't know how to explain it, but as I watched the fire burn, I felt a sudden weight lift from my chest. It was like a cloud had been dispersed, and I could finally breathe again. The sense of oppression that had hung over me for so long seemed to dissipate in the flickering flames. I felt a strange sense of relief, almost like I could laugh or dance around the fire like a child. It was like I had been freed from something that had been holding me captive for weeks, and for the first time in ages, I felt like I could actually relax. I started to cry, the tears flowing freely, but this time they weren't out of fear or pain. They were tears of relief, of release. Whatever had been haunting me was gone. From that night on, the nightmares stopped. No more blood-soaked dreams, no more violent visions. I slept better in my own bed than I had all month. I finally felt at peace. But that wasn't the end of the story. I still experience strange occurrences from time to time, but they're not like they were before. I have ghosts now, but they're different. They don't frighten me. In fact, they feel almost familiar, like old friends visiting from the other side. I have a ghost kitty who likes to curl up on the couch with me when I'm watching TV. Sometimes, people who visit my house mention seeing my resident shadow man, a figure who seems to linger near the walls or in the corners of rooms. I like to think it's my husband's grandpa, watching over us, protecting us from whatever may lurk in the darkness. I'm not scared of my ghosts. They're a part of who I am now, and I've come to accept them. After everything I've been through, I don't think I could ever be frightened by something as simple as a shadow or a fleeting glimpse of a phantom. I'm a freak, and I'm proud of it. I've faced down the darkness, and I've come out the other side stronger, more connected to the unknown. The ghosts are a part of me, just as I am a part of them, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Let me give you some background first, so you can understand where I'm coming from before I dive into the events that nearly broke me. I'm a 20-year-old guy, studying political science at Cal State Long Beach. I'm also a member of a fraternity on campus. I don't mess with drugs, and during the course of what happened, I only smoked weed once. I don't care if you don't believe me. I'm not here to convince you beyond sharing the facts of what I experienced. This is just my story. It was mid-January 2011 when my best friend, Ryan, and I decided to move out of the fraternity house. We were both sick of the chaos and wanted to find a place that would bring some normalcy back into our lives. After a bit of searching, we found a 2-bedroom apartment in downtown Long Beach for $1,200 a month, which fit our budget. We were excited to make the move and get out of the frat house as soon as possible. The day after we moved in, something weird happened. I was taking my second shower in the new place when the doorbell rang. It was our downstairs neighbor, and she wasn't happy. Apparently, water was leaking into her unit from ours. I went straight to the water heater to check it out and found water gushing from an emergency release valve at the top, something that should never have been opened. It was bizarre. The maintenance guy came by and said there was nothing we could have done to prevent it, but that didn't make the situation any less strange. A few weeks later, near the end of February, I came home from my crappy job at the CSULB bookstore. When I got to the apartment, I found Ryan standing on the second-story balcony, locked out. He was knocking on the glass door and asking me to let him in. I thought it was pretty funny and asked him how long he had been locked out. Turns out, he'd been stuck out there for 6 hours. His right arm was in a splint from a shoulder surgery, so he couldn't climb down to get help, and he didn't have his phone on him. He told me he swore the door was unlocked when he stepped out for a cigarette, but for some reason it had slammed shut and locked behind him. We both thought it was kind of strange, but brushed it off as just one of those odd things that happens. Still, it stuck with me a little. Then, a few days later, Ryan offered me a bowl of weed to help us celebrate our newfound freedom away from the frat house. I don't usually smoke, but I decided it would be a fun way to unwind. I went to bed about 45 minutes later. But what happened next was something I could never explain away. I felt a terror like I've never felt before in my life. It wasn't from the weed. It was something else entirely. The air around me felt thick, and there was this overwhelming sense of negative energy in the room. I felt as though there was something in there with me, something that wasn't human. I could hear voices in my head, thoughts that weren't mine, and they were dark and violent. Then the door to my room started bouncing back and forth, as though someone was trying to get in. I panicked and slammed my windows shut, but it didn't stop. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger. My phone, which I had left on the windowsill, buzzed with a notification, so I grabbed it to check. It showed a new message, but when I clicked on it, there was nothing there. I thought maybe my phone was glitching, but at that moment, it felt like more than just a technical issue. It was like the room itself was messing with me. I texted Ryan to tell him what was going on, and he responded calmly, telling me to relax and go to bed. But I couldn't. I lay awake, terrified, as the shadows in my room seemed to move on their own. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just some bad weed, but the fear lingered. A few weeks later, I was at work when I got a text from Ryan saying he was locked out of the apartment again. I left work early to let him in. When I arrived, he was looking pretty freaked out. He told me that this time, he had left the sliding door cracked open just a few inches when he went outside, and when he came back, it had slammed shut on its own and locked behind him. To lock the door, you had to push the lock up against gravity, which made it almost impossible for it to just shut on its own. We both agreed it was pretty disturbing, but we tried to move past it and continued on with our daily lives. On March 15, 2011, I came home after my classes to find Ryan's room completely destroyed. It was unlike anything I had ever seen. The room looked like it had been hit by a tornado. Clothes were scattered everywhere, items were knocked over, and his heavy wooden desk had been flipped completely upside down. The pencil tray had been ripped out and dumped all over the floor, and papers and books were thrown all over the place. It was complete chaos. The room was unrecognizable, like someone or something had gone on a rampage. I looked through the glass door and saw Ryan standing on the balcony, banging on the glass, looking desperate. "Chris, let me in, man. Hurry up, let me the fuck in," he shouted, his voice filled with panic. I opened the door for him, and as soon as he stepped inside, he blurted out, "Bro, all of this shit happened while I was out there." I fucking watched as my room was completely torn apart by some invisible force for half an hour. I was stunned. Ryan's face was pale, and he was shaking. He told me that he had gone outside for a smoke, just like any other day. This time, he said, he had left the sliding door halfway open. At first, he heard the door start to slide shut on its own, so he rushed over to stop it. But as he grabbed it, the door seemed to have a mind of its own. It pulled him with it, as though some invisible force was yanking it closed. He swore that he fought to keep the door open, but the force was too strong. And then, as he stood there smoking, he watched in horror as his room was ransacked by something he couldn't see. The room was being destroyed right before his eyes. Items were flying off shelves, papers were being scattered, and his desk was overturned. And all he could do was watch. He smoked a whole pack of cigarettes during the ordeal. Still unable to move, his mind racing with confusion and fear. I was completely freaked out, and the idea of staying in that apartment anymore made my stomach turn. I was ready to get out of there and never go back. I suggested to Ryan that we should leave for a while, take some time away from the apartment. But, as always, he had this tough guy attitude. He wasn't ready to give in. He wanted to clean up the mess, pretend like everything was fine, and just ignore what had happened. But I knew we were dealing with something that couldn't just be ignored. I ended up couch surfing at friends' places for about a week. Every day I tried to talk myself into going back, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me in that apartment. The idea of facing whatever force was in there terrified me to my core. But eventually, I gathered enough courage to return. The weeks that followed were nothing short of a nightmare. Every time I tried to get some sleep in my room, strange things would happen. I'd be lying there in bed, trying to relax, when suddenly my door would start shaking. It would rattle back and forth as though something was trying to force its way in.
It wasn't just the door shaking, though. The entire room felt like it was vibrating with energy, as if it was alive with malevolent intent. And then, every so often, I would hear a loud bang against the door, like someone was pounding on it from the other side. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore. One night, after a particularly violent bang on the door, I decided to do something about it. I shoved my shoes up against the door to stop it from rattling. I thought that would keep it from shaking, but the next morning, when I woke up, I was horrified to find one of my shoes had been moved to the other side of the room. It was like the door, and whatever was causing it to shake had reached inside the room and moved it. I couldn't understand what was happening. I couldn't explain it. I tried to keep my cool, but the paranoia was creeping in. The more time I spent in that apartment, the more I realized it wasn't just a series of coincidences. Something was going on, something beyond our control, and the more we tried to ignore it, the worse it got. Ryan would often go home to San Diego on weekends, which meant I spent a lot of time alone in the apartment. During these moments of solitude, things became even more unsettling. I would hear footsteps on the carpet next to me as I tried to fall asleep. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but it kept happening. Clear, distinct footsteps, like someone walking through the room. Along with the footsteps, I began to sense an overwhelming, oppressive energy, a kind of negative presence that seemed to be inescapable. It wasn't like the kind of fear you get when you're alone in a dark room. It was more like a constant weight pressing on you. A sensation I couldn't explain, but one I could always feel when it was around. Goosebumps would rise on my skin out of nowhere, and I would shudder as the atmosphere seemed to grow colder. It was unlike anything I had ever experienced, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to notice. My sleeping habits started to deteriorate. It became almost impossible for me to fall asleep before 2 a.m., no matter how tired I was. Something would always keep me awake. It was like the apartment itself was alive, keeping me from resting. The worst part was the growling sound. It was low-pitched, rumbling, and extremely eerie. At first, I thought it was the sound of an airplane flying overhead, but after going outside to check and not hearing anything, I realized the source was coming from inside the apartment. It was like some deep, animalistic growl reverberating through the walls. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but I could feel it vibrating in the pit of my stomach, and it was terrifying. It got to the point where I couldn't even sleep in peace anymore.
The growls would echo through the walls, and I would lie there wide awake, paralyzed by the fear that something was lurking just out of sight. Eventually, I found myself unable to keep track of everything that happened, but I'll try to list the events as best I can. In mid-April, Ryan's girlfriend, Taylor, came over for a visit. We were all sitting around, trying to put a movie in the Xbox when, without warning, the power went out. The strange part was that the power only cut out in our 2 bedrooms. Every other part of the apartment was still lit up. It was an odd coincidence, but we shrugged it off. It wasn't until later that we realized this was just one of many oddities that seemed to plague us. We decided to play a game of Uno on the carpet in the living room to kill time. As we played, something else bizarre happened. We all heard a distinct sound, something sliding across the kitchen's tile countertop. I froze, and we all exchanged uneasy looks. I got up to investigate, and to my disbelief I found it. A bottle of André champagne, sliding slowly across the counter, as if some invisible hand had pushed it. It was the kind of thing that made you question whether you had actually seen it happen or if your mind was playing tricks on you. A few weeks later, just days before we finally broke our lease and moved out, I found myself alone again in the apartment. I was sitting in my room, scrolling through Reddit, when I glanced across the room and noticed something strange. My MacBook charger was moving on its own. It wasn't just shifting a little, it was swaying back and forth, twisting in strange patterns like it was alive. I didn't know what to think. I left the room quickly, my heart pounding in my chest, and went into the kitchen to calm myself. But things only got worse. As I opened the cupboard to get a drink, I was hit with another strange discovery. My unopened box of honey bunches of oats, don't judge, it's delicious, had been torn open. The bag inside was pulled out at a weird angle, like something had reached inside the box and ripped it open with force. There was no way it could have happened naturally. It was as though the box had been tampered with, or worse, something had done it intentionally. I didn't stick around to investigate further. At that point, I'd had enough. I grabbed my things and decided to spend the night at the fraternity house. It was the only place I could think of where I might feel safe. I've been on an expedition in Vermont for some time now with my friend, and we've encountered some pretty unexplainable things. People think that because we live in such a rural state, essentially on the edge of Canada, nothing unusual could happen here. Sure, there are some cities like St. Albans, Burlington, and Rutland, but those are more like large towns than actual cities, and they're surrounded by vast stretches of farmland and forests. Beyond these pockets of civilization are rural areas filled with farmland and dense woods. In these areas, the feeling of safety comes from the dimly lit farmhouses scattered across the hundreds of miles of forest. It's quiet, isolated, and peaceful, until you realize how easily something could be lurking in those dark woods. One night, while traveling up one of the main roads in Vermont, I saw something that I'll never forget. To this day, I still have no idea what it was, and I hope I never see it again. It all started when I was on a midnight hike with my friend and my girlfriend up one of Vermont's many mountains. We were passing through a rural area, surrounded by vast stretches of farmland with hilly terrain. We were having a good time, joking around, and marveling at how beautiful the starry night sky looked. My girlfriend was sitting in the passenger seat, flipping through the pictures she had taken of the stars. As we drove through the hills, we began discussing how eerie it could feel to drive through rural Vermont at night. When you pass through these sparsely populated areas, you often get the sensation that something is moving in the fields. Or you think you saw something dart across your headlights. Driving at night can be especially unnerving because of the wildlife. Moose are massive creatures, and if you ever encounter one, all you'll see is a huge black mass in front of you. Many of the shadows we saw in the distance could usually be explained away as just wildlife moving around. But there was something else that night, something that felt different. This night was different. As we crested one of the hills, we were probably driving around 40 miles per hour, when we suddenly spotted a figure standing in the middle of the road. Instinctively, I started to slow down. My friend Steve and my girlfriend Mary both looked at me, confused and uneasy. "What is he doing?" Steve asked, his voice laced with concern. "I don't know," I replied, equally uncertain. We were getting closer quickly despite my efforts to slow down. The man appeared to be wearing a black hooded robe, with the fabric flowing all the way down to the ground, almost touching the pavement. It seemed like he was floating rather than standing. A chill of dread crept over me as we passed him. I turned my head to glance at the figure as we continued moving down the road. There was something profoundly wrong about him. I couldn't see a face, nor any hands, legs, or feet. Everything below the robe was either hidden or completely absent. I felt a surge of panic and sped up. "Fuck this shit," I muttered under my breath, my heart pounding. "Babe," Mary screamed from the passenger seat. I thought she was angry because I had just floored it, pushing the car to 90 miles per hour as I raced down the straight, hilly road, cresting one hill and feeling the car lift off the ground. "Babe, look," she screamed again, her voice full of alarm. When I turned to look, my blood ran cold. The shadowy figure was right there, hovering next to the car as if it had never moved. It was floating beside us, moving as if it were attached to the car itself. I swerved, trying to hit whatever this thing was, but to my horror, it swerved with me, as if it had no intention of letting us escape. I pushed the pedal to the floor again, desperate to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever this creature was. But no matter how fast I drove, it stayed right next to the car, keeping pace with us. The glass of the car windows began to fog up, and Mary quickly turned on the heater, hoping it would clear the glass. But the fog only grew thicker and more suffocating, until I could barely see out the windshield. I wiped the fog away with the wipers, but it was becoming impossible to see anything. Then, out of nowhere, I noticed the glow of streetlights ahead. Relief washed over me as I realized we were nearing some sort of town. I had no choice but to stop. The visibility was now zero. We sat there in silence, staring at each other, unsure whether we should open the door and look outside. I turned on the hazard lights and tried to listen for any sound that would indicate the thing was still there. Then, I thought I heard a car pass us, or at least, I thought it was a car. The sound reassured me, and I hoped it meant the shadow figure had gone. I opened the door cautiously, bracing myself for what I might find. To my surprise, there was nothing. No figure, no person, no sign of anything paranormal. Just the empty road stretching for miles in both directions, and the distant red taillights of a passing vehicle. The shadow had vanished. The cold air rushed in as the windows slowly defogged, and we all stepped out of the car, still in shock. "What just happened?" Mary asked, her voice a mixture of confusion and nervous laughter. Steve stood silently, staring out into the fields, his eyes wide but unblinking. I looked down at my feet, my heart still pounding in my chest. It was 2 a.m. now, and I had no idea what the hell we had just witnessed. All I wanted was to get home and forget the entire experience. We were now outside a good-sized town, and when the fog cleared from the windows, we got back in the car. We drove off in silence, the weight of what we had seen hanging heavily in the air. Nothing else strange happened, but none of us spoke much after that. The eerie quiet of the night seemed to settle over us as we continued down the road, the memory of the shadow figure lingering in the back of our minds. It's the kind of thing you don't talk about after it happens. How do you even begin to explain what you saw and experienced? It's one of those moments that leaves you speechless, haunted by a truth you can't quite make sense of. The next day, we tried to talk about it, mostly to try and piece together what had happened. Steve and Mary both admitted that they felt the same overwhelming sense of dread that I did. It was a shared experience, and the intensity of it made it even harder to dismiss. At one point, before the windows fogged up, they both claimed they saw the figure's head twist around, almost unnaturally, like it was trying to reach into the car. They said the movement was jerky, like something not entirely human. The fogging of the windows started right after that, and Steve mentioned that he thought the figure's strange, unsettling movement might have been the cause. The tension in the car had been so thick, it felt like the very air around us was changing, suffocating us. I wish I could say this story was some sort of elaborate fiction. A scene ripped straight out of a Stephen King novel or a terrifying urban legend, but I can't. It's real. And the knowledge that it's real, that I actually saw something I can't explain, has messed with my head in ways I can't quite put into words. Before that night, I used to love driving through the rural areas of Vermont at night. The roads were quiet, the air crisp, and the stars seemed to shine so brightly without any light pollution to dim them. It was peaceful. It was beautiful. But now I avoid those roads. I stick to the interstate. Or better yet, I just stay home. The thought of driving out there at night fills me with an uneasy sense of dread that I can't shake off. That thing, whatever it was, has taken that small, quiet part of Vermont away from me. I can't look at the stars the same way, and I can't trust the darkness anymore. It's not a fear I can explain. It's not something I ever wanted to experience again. But I know deep down that there are things in this world that we're not meant to understand. And that night, we encountered one of them. I grew up in a small, rural town where everyone knew everyone's business. Life was simple. Dirt roads, a single stop sign that was more for target practice than actual use, and a community where people worked hard on the farm and respected tradition. We didn't eat what we didn't shoot, catch, or grow. It was the kind of place where your family had deep roots and everyone was tough in their own way. I grew up with my cousin Renee in a surprisingly nice double-wide trailer on 2 acres of land, about 45 minutes from where I worked the night shift. It was peaceful, just the 2 of us and our 2 pit bulls. The nights were quiet. We'd sit on the porch, cracking open beers or taking shots, chatting, playing cards, and sometimes smoking a little weed. Nobody ever cared. My second cousin was the town's police chief, so we had some unspoken leeway. It was a good life, mostly. We weren't rich, but we had what we needed and lived without a care in the world. And then one night, something happened that would change everything. I can't fully explain what it was, but it was unlike anything I had ever felt before. You've heard the phrase, terror beyond words, right? That night, I came face to face with a fear that was not just emotional or mental, but a primal, physical sensation that stopped my mind from working altogether. It was the kind of fear that takes over every part of you, and in that moment, there's no thinking, just running. All the bravado and tough guy persona I had built over the years crumbled, replaced by an instinctual need to survive. Up until that night, I thought I knew fear. I had been in the military, been shot at, and had lived through more stressful situations than I care to count. Hell, I even grew up watching Hellraiser and thought Pinhead wasn't so bad, just a misunderstood guy who gave Kirsty a break. But that night shattered whatever concept of fear I thought I understood. It started like any other evening. Renee and I were sitting on the porch, enjoying the night air. We were in the middle of a card game when suddenly I felt it. At first, it was a strange, almost imperceptible feeling, a shiver up my spine, a tightness in my chest. Then, a feeling I can't describe settled over me. It was heavy, suffocating. It was like the air had thickened, and something was watching us. Something that didn't belong. I glanced at Renee, but she didn't seem to notice. Our dogs, usually alert and full of energy, were eerily still, lying by the door. The night had grown still, too still. Not a single rustle in the trees, not a sound from the usual night critters. And then, I saw it. At the edge of our property, near the tree line, there was a figure. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out much detail, but it was definitely a person. But something about it was wrong. Too still. Too unmoving, like a statue. I squinted, trying to make out what I was seeing, but I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. It wasn't the way a person stood. There was no subtle shifting of weight, no adjustment of posture. It was just there. I turned to Renee, but she was already looking at me. Her face had gone pale. "Do you see that?" she whispered. I nodded, my throat tight. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but all I could think of was the sheer, overpowering sense of dread that was creeping in. It felt like something was wrong, like this figure didn't belong here. It wasn't the quiet, peaceful night I'd grown up with. It was something else. Something not of this world. We watched it for what felt like an eternity, but it never moved. It just stood there, as though it was waiting for something. Or maybe for us. I don't know. But then something shifted in the air. The temperature dropped, and suddenly the dogs went crazy. barking like mad. It was the kind of bark you only hear when they sense danger. They weren't just protecting the yard, they were terrified. That's when I knew this wasn't just some trick of the light or my imagination. "Let's go inside," I muttered, my voice low, trembling. But before we could even move, the figure shifted. It didn't walk or run. It simply glided toward us, impossibly fast, covering the distance between us in what seemed like a fraction of a second. That's when I felt it. A bone-chilling, suffocating fear that took over my entire body. My legs locked, and my breath caught in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out, but I couldn't move. I could only stare as this thing approached. Renee grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door, but by then it was too late. Whatever it was had reached the edge of the porch. I could feel it, just out of my sight, like it was right there, pressing against the very air itself. Then, in an instant, it vanished. Gone. Just like that. No sound, no trace. We bolted inside, locking every door, shutting every window. I don't know how long we sat there in silence, just staring at each other, too terrified to speak. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened, but the only thing I could feel was that fear, the raw, unexplainable terror that would haunt me for the rest of my life. That night changed something in me. The person I was before, the tough, fearless guy who had been through hell and back, was gone. What I felt that night was beyond anything I could have imagined. Something so primal that it defied logic. It wasn't just fear. It was terror. The kind that stays with you long after the event has passed. I don't know what I saw that night, and I'm not sure I ever want to know. All I know is this: it was real, and it was something that I'll never forget. Something that no amount of training or experience can ever prepare you for. The next morning, Renee told me what happened. Drake was still freaked out. He wouldn't even come back to the house after what had gone down the night before. To get the full picture, though, you need to understand just how tough Drake is. This guy wasn't someone who's scared easily. He had that hardened, no-nonsense attitude you expect from someone who grew up in the same kind of place we did. Farming, working hard, toughing it out. But that night, something had shaken him to his core. Renee had been calling him all morning, trying to get him to explain why he'd left without a word in the middle of the night. It wasn't until late in the afternoon when he finally picked up the phone, and when he did, it was clear he was still rattled. "I ain't coming back out there again," Drake shouted into the phone, his voice tense. "What the hell, Drake? Why'd you leave without saying a word?" Renee fired back, obviously pissed. "Because, man, there's something in that fucking house. I ain't coming back out there, I told you already." "I don't know what the hell it is, but I'm done," he said, his voice shaking. Now, that was weird. Drake was never scared. But now he was acting like he'd seen a ghost. And not in the usual, just a creepy feeling way, either. No, he sounded like something had really, truly messed with him. "What are you talking about?" Renee pressed. "Look, I was watching that movie and getting ready to go to bed. Your cousin was asleep. Then the dogs jumped up, ran into the living room, and started growling down the hall. I thought maybe somebody was pulling up in the driveway or something, right?" His words were coming fast, as if he couldn't get them out quick enough. "Okay, well, who was it?" Renee asked, now fully intrigued, though still annoyed. "Nobody was out there," he said, sounding confused and panicked. "I opened up the front door and the outside lights were on, but no one was there, and then the dog stopped growling and started whining. Brody starts backing up and then runs back to the room with his tail between his legs, ears laid back, and Nairobi, she follows him, exactly the same way." Renee was silent for a moment, processing, and Drake's voice went low, almost to a whisper. "Look, Renee, just forget it. I'm not coming back out there. End of discussion, I'm fucking done. I mean it." Renee didn't let it go, though. She was pacing now, moving from the living room into the kitchen, trying to get him to explain. "What the hell happened?" she demanded. "Quit playing and just tell me." Drake went quiet for a second, then his voice dropped even further. "I don't know what it was, but I don't ever want to find out again. It was like the whole house just changed. It felt off. Everything about it felt off. You know that feeling, like when you're alone in a room and you just know someone's watching you, but when you turn around, there's no one there. That's how it was. But it was way worse. Like something like someone was standing just out of sight, right in the dark corners of the house. But I couldn't see anything, not even a shadow. The dogs knew it too. They felt it too. And when they backed up and ran, I knew I had to get out of there. At that point, Renee had stopped moving, just standing still with the phone in her hand, staring at the ground as if trying to make sense of it all. "What do you think it was?" she asked, a slight tremor in her voice. Drake didn't answer right away, like he was trying to swallow down whatever fear was choking him up. "I don't know. But whatever it was, I ain't messing with it. You can believe that." And with that, he hung up. That was it. No more explanation, no reason, no second chances. He was done. But what really freaked me out wasn't just what happened. It was how scared Drake had sounded. This was a guy who faced danger head-on every single day of his life. And now he was acting like he'd seen something that rattled him to his very core. And that scared me more than anything. That night, I couldn't shake the feeling. Something had happened. Something had changed. Something was still out there, and we didn't know what it was. But we sure as hell weren't going to try to find out. Drake's voice trembled with each word he spoke, and you could tell this wasn't the usual tough guy attitude he put on for everything. He was shaken, really shaken, and it had nothing to do with the usual bullshit that scared people. This was something real, something he couldn't explain. It hit him hard. "I don't know, okay? I don't fucking know. I ain't saying there's a ghost or whatever, but I'm just telling you, something is wrong in that house. Like, I don't even know what to say, Renee. You know I don't believe in that ghost shit. But something ain't right," he said, his voice tight, strained like he was trying to convince himself of it. It didn't sound like someone just messing around anymore. Renee was worried. I could hear it in her voice. She could tell he was struggling to say whatever it was that was crawling under his skin. He'd never been like this before. Not ever. He was always calm, collected, tough, you know? That's just who he was. "Drake, it's okay. It's fine, okay? Just tell me what happened. We'll figure it out. You don't have to come back out here if it's that serious, okay? Baby, just tell me what's wrong," Renee said, trying to calm him down, even though she was clearly getting freaked out herself. Drake took a deep breath, the kind that felt like it was trying to steady himself. When he spoke again, it was slower, heavier, like he was putting the pieces together in his mind. "Okay. Okay, so the dogs ran back to the room, whining, right?" he asked, as if trying to bring it all back into focus. "Right," Renee said, waiting for him to keep going.
I'm just kind of laughing, stupid dogs and shit, when it felt like somebody was right behind me. Like right fucking there, you feel me?" He paused, then continued, his voice a little shaky. "So I turn around real quick, and the hallway's dark, right? There's nothing there. So I start to grab my cigarettes and head to the room when I heard something." "Hear something like what, Drake?" Renee asked, her concern growing with every word. "Like a whisper or something? Like somebody was right behind me whispering?" I figured it was just the TV, so I grabbed the remote to turn it off. But as soon as I picked it up, something snatched it out of my hand. Drake's breath was heavy again, his voice almost cracking with the terror of it all. "I just left it, right?" and started walking back to the room fast, because it just didn't feel right in there. It felt heavy or something. But as soon as I took a step, something pushed me back. Hard. I felt it, Renee. One hand just shoved me back, but there was nothing there. Nothing I could see. I didn't know what to do, so I grabbed my shoes, and I was about to get the hell out of there, when I heard this laugh. A laugh. Not a funny one, not a ha-ha that was cute laugh. It was low and real deep, like a man was laughing right beside me. I freaked the fuck out. I don't know what was happening, but I dropped my shoes and ran for the door. I opened it, and... He paused, clearly choking on the memory, his voice going quieter. It slammed shut. "And that lamp? The lamp right next to the chair, the one in the living room? That lamp just cut off, just turned off, and the whole room was pitch black. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe. It had me, Renee. It had me. I couldn't open the door. It was just locked. It was like it was holding me in there. And I could hear it breathing in my ear. Do you hear me?" "I could hear it breathing," he said, his voice cracking, and I could hear the tears forming in his words. Then I felt this burning pain down my back, like fire, all down the right side of my body. I couldn't even yell for you. It was like I was paralyzed, like everything just stopped. When that pain hit me, everything went still, and I jerked open the door. I jumped off the damn porch. I didn't even look back. I got in my car and drove the hell out of there. The man who never flinched, never backed down from anything, was crying. Actual tears, not just fear or anger. He was broken in that moment. It was the kind of cry you don't expect from someone like him. And I couldn't blame him. Whatever he'd experienced, it had broken something inside him. Renee didn't tell me right away. She kept it from me for a while, and I'm not sure if she believed him at first, or if she thought maybe he was overreacting, or if she was trying to protect me from it. But I didn't find out until much later, after the whole thing started to come apart at the seams.
A couple of days passed, and things only seemed to get worse. Renee was either at work or with Drake, and I was working extra shifts. So when I finally had a night off, I figured I'd go home. No big deal, just needed to do some laundry, clean up, and finish an essay for class. It wasn't too late when I pulled up to the house, maybe around 9 p.m. The yard was pitch black, but one of the porch lights was on, enough to help me get up the steps. I noticed Renee's car wasn't there, but that didn't bother me. I wasn't scared of the dark. I opened the door, flicked the light switch for the overhead, and it immediately blew out. Weird, but whatever. I tried the lamp next, and it burned out too, just like that. Something about it felt off, though. A weird feeling in my gut, and the hairs on my neck stood up, but I ignored it. I had to cross the room to get to the kitchen light, and that blew too, with a loud pop. I turned around, a little unnerved, and flicked on the hallway light. I took just 2 quick steps down the hall toward my room, and suddenly I felt it, this suffocating weight on my chest, like the air was thick and heavy. The hallway light blew out too. Every instinct, every fiber of my being screamed at me to get out, to run. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it deep in my bones. I turned and bolted, out the door, standing under the porch light, shaking and fumbling with my phone. The battery was full, so I breathed a sigh of relief. I wasn't panicking yet, but my pulse was quickening. I decided to just go to John's place. I'd crashed there for the night. I didn't even stop to wonder why the dogs weren't barking, or why Renee still wasn't home. I put the key in the ignition and turned it. Nothing. The car didn't make a sound, like the battery had completely died. Impossible. I had just gotten there. My heart pounded as I grabbed my phone again to call John. I scrolled down to his name, hit call, and then call ended. I tried again, just 1 ring, then call ended. I wasn't panicked, but I was getting there. I looked up at the dark house, and then just as I glanced down at my phone again, I saw it. The lamp inside came on. It was a pull-string lamp, and I knew you had to pull it hard while holding the base for it to light. But I saw it, just like that. It flicked on. I froze. The curtain inside moved slightly, and then the lamp switched off again. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, so hard I thought I might pass out. I knew there was no one in there. No one. I tried calling John again, and this time he answered immediately. And the phone cut out. It didn't just end the call, it died. A full battery, completely drained. I couldn't even charge it because the car battery was dead too. John came and picked me up, and I was shaking so hard I couldn't speak. I didn't tell him what happened. I didn't think he'd believe me or understand what it felt like to be suffocated by something in that house. Something that wasn't just wrong, but terrifying. The next morning, John brought me back to the house, just as the sun was rising. As we pulled into the driveway, I noticed Renee's car parked there. I thanked John and got out, walking past the car when I saw her sitting inside with her toddler in her lap. She wasn't asleep, just sitting there, staring ahead. I walked up, and she got out. I asked what was going on, and that's when she told me about what happened with Drake. She had refused to go inside until either I showed up or it was daylight. She didn't want to take little man in there. I understood that. I didn't go into details about what happened the night before, just gave her the basics. Before we went inside, I stopped by my car to grab my bag. On impulse, I tried starting it. It cranked right up without hesitation. I gritted my teeth, unsettled, but we headed inside together. When we opened the door, the house was completely different. All the lights were on, every single one. All the cabinets were open too. Kitchen, bathrooms, everywhere. The furniture was all moved around, the couch pulled into the middle of the room, the side table shoved in front of the recliner, and the bookshelf, heavy as hell, had been dragged 6 inches away from the wall, tilted at an odd angle. It looked like absolute chaos. The beds were unmade, pillows and sheets scattered across the floor. Dishes and silverware were strewn all over the kitchen. But the worst part? There were scratch marks on the walls and hardwood floor. The floor could have been from the dogs, sure, but the marks on the walls? They were near the ceiling. The dogs couldn't have done that. Both Brody and Nairobi were hiding under the bed. They were so scared they wouldn't come out, and when we tried to pull them out, they snapped at us. They didn't want to move, not at all. Eventually, we had to open both the back door and the bedroom door, move the bed slightly, and only then would they bolt outside. They refused to go back inside. From that day on, our inside dogs were outside dogs. We spent the rest of the day cleaning up, putting everything back in order, but neither of us really talked about what we were feeling. It felt wrong, off in a way I couldn't explain. That evening, we went to Drake's place. That's when we both told him everything. When I saw him, I noticed the claw marks on his back. They weren't just scratches, they looked like deep gouges, 4 of them in a row. It looked like something had actually torn into him. As far as I know, he never went back to that house. I didn't go back for my things until a week later, and even then, I brought a few friends with me, mainly for moral support and to help with the heavy lifting. But the most messed up part? A couple weeks before all of this happened, Little Man had been waking up crying in the middle of the night. Renee had to bring him to bed with her. Then one night, he woke up screaming and the dog started barking like crazy. Renee even put Nairobi in his kennel because they thought maybe he had bitten him. But that wasn't possible. Nairobi had never shown any aggression, especially not toward the toddler. Now I wonder, was it the dog that bit him? Or whatever the hell had torn apart the house and clawed into Drake? Something was in that house, something that wasn't normal, and it still haunted me.
Stories may end, but the fear remains. Subscribe to uncover more secrets hidden in the darkness. Until we meet again in the world of nightmarish shadows.